Most of us that grew up in the South, there's, I guess, something that everyone or most everyone, maybe every household does every Saturday morning. If you grew up in the South and you're a football fan, then probably you have College Game Day on the TV every Saturday morning. I don't remember watching it as much because we like to hunt, and on Saturday mornings during football season, we were usually in the woods. But I guess the good thing about social media now is that you can pretty much watch all of game day as you scroll social media, because any clip of anything that someone said or any prediction that someone made about the day's upcoming football games will usually be on social media. And a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, I was scrolling through social media and I came across a clip from Nick Saban. Now, obviously, most of you that know me, I'm not an Alabama fan. I don't follow Alabama football very closely. I do now because I love you guys and you love Alabama football, so I follow it a little closer. But I know that one thing that I've always been impressed with about Nick Saban is his ability to speak. And I guess the way he's put together, the way he uses his words, even the qualities that he possesses while he leads his teams. And it's no wonder that people follow after him, that kids would flock to play for him because of his leadership. And there was something that he said a couple of weeks ago that really caught my attention as I was scrolling through social media. And he was talking about Alabama, the place where he had coached for all of these years. And he was talking about some of the struggles that they had this season and their efforts. And he said, I think the thing that Alabama needs to do is to quit worrying about winning and getting back to playing to a standard. Now listen to him say that, and I was trying to process what he might have meant when he says that they needed to quit worrying about winning and get back to playing to a standard. And what I realized was that there's this element or mindset of our attitudes that we sometimes we just want to win. I mean, really, and that's what those kids do. Every time they step on the field, they think win. And so maybe that means that they don't fulfill their responsibility in an effort to gamble, say, on a 50-50 pass, and they get themselves out of position and they lose. In their mind, they're thinking, I've got to win. We've got to win. So they do something crazy, and then they end up missing on the play and eventually end up losing the game. But if the mindset was, I'm going to do my job, and I'm going to do it right every play. Sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. But at the end of the day, what can always be said is, I lived up to the standard. Now, I listened to Nick Saban say that, and I was thinking, trying to process, at least that was my take on what he was saying, that they needed to play to a standard. And it just got me to thinking really about our faith and about Christianity and how sometimes we really do the same thing in life, that we play to win. We play to win the world. We play to win the affection of other people. We play to win the approval of other people. We play to win and get the most out of life for the best of our comfort or the best of our experiences, instead of living to a standard, or maybe in an effort to realize that we can't always live up to the standard. At least that's what we tell ourselves. We begin to lower the standard so we don't even have to worry about it altogether. I was reading through the New Testament, and I've started to take notice of all the times that Jesus left for his disciples the standard. The standard that is the gospel, the way of life that Jesus models and he lives. And he essentially gives to them this method of behavior, these moral principles that guide who they are and what they do. And he leaves them with this understanding: this is the standard and this is how you live. Don't lower it. Don't try to do more than that. That's what the Pharisees did. Just live by the standard and everything will be okay. This morning, I want us to think about living up to the standard, about how sometimes we have a tendency to lower the standard in order to please ourselves, or maybe sometimes how we play to win the affection of the world or the approval of other people. But that if we just live by the standard that God expects, how different our lives would be. It made me think about what a standard is. In some ways, a standard is a level of achievement, or it's a quality of achievement. And in other ways, it's moral principles that affect our behaviors and our beliefs and the things that we do or say. And maybe Christianity is the latter of the two, that God set forth moral principles in the gospel that affects how we think and affects how we live, that Christians who have obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ have submitted themselves to the standard, these moral principles that guide them to be more like Jesus as they live. And it's largely the case that more people, I think, probably play to win than they do to live by the standard. Or like I mentioned to you earlier, a temptation that I have occasionally is to lower the standard, because sometimes I think to myself, I can't do that. Like Tim even mentioned a moment ago, it's impossible to do that. We can't possibly live like Jesus wants me to live. And so these are the temptations that I face. There was a guy that I had listened to on a podcast, a TED Talk, actually. His name was Michael Brody Waite. And in this TED Talk, he described his process of escaping an addiction that he had, a drug addiction, an alcohol addiction. That he went into detail about the process and the journey that he took to get from addiction to success and addiction to recovery. And he mentions that he had started to go to this rehab facility, and there was a group of people that were ministering to him and caring for him and trying to help him out of his addiction. They were pouring into him, doing all kinds of things, I guess, to help him. They were trying these processes, these different methods, these 3-step, 5 steps, all kinds of things that they were doing to serve Mr. Waite in his addiction. And one of the things that he mentioned was that when he entered a group that finally helped him turn around by loving him, and his words were, by giving him a standard. And he said, now that standard consists of 3 things. He said the first one was rigorous activity, rigorous authenticity in your activity. If you're going to do it, be busy at doing something, but be real. Be all in the moment, and be real while you're doing it. Be honest, be transparent, but you've got to be doing something. Rigorous, authentic activity was step number 1. Step number 2 was surrender the outcome. It was like he was trying to control everything in his life. Surrender the outcome. Just do what you know is right. Rigorous, authentic, real, honest activity, and let go of the outcome. And the third step for the standard that helped him from addiction to success was do uncomfortable work. In order to get out of the addiction, that means he was going to have to do things that were uncomfortable to him, things that he had created as habits in his life, things that he needed in order to live, at least in his mind. He had to break that cycle by doing something that was uncomfortable. And for you and I to not lower the standard or to not go beyond it and try to do what we think will get us the most success in the moment or in the event, but to just live up to the standard, it involves all 3 of those things. Rigorous, authentic activity, to be honest and to be real, but to be busy doing something and to realize that the outcome lies not in my hands, but in the hands of God, whose hands are perfect, right? And then not only that, but to realize at the end of the day that in order to live by the standard, especially what we just read in Matthew 5 that Connor read for us a moment ago, especially doing that, that's hard work. It's uncomfortable for us to love our enemies and to live to the standard of the gospel, but I think we can do it. I think Nick Saban was right, at least as far as Alabama is concerned. And I think maybe there's something bigger that looms in the air this morning for us to think about not playing to win the approval of the world or the approval of other people or win all the successes of the world, but for you and I this morning to decide that we're going to live by the standard, that we're going to live our lives according to the standard and let that dictate how we live. Let's glance at a text where Jesus set forth a standard. It's kind of like what Mr. Waite mentioned, that they gave him a standard, but there were 3 facets. The gospel is the standard, but there's multiple facets. And Matthew 5:38 through 44 is just one of those, but I think it's a good place for us to start. Let's read together. Connor finished in verse number 44. Let's keep reading in verse 45. He says, I'm telling you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, verse 44, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward will you have? Don't even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and your sisters, what are you doing out of the ordinary? Don't even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. I forgot to grab the clicker back there, so Walker, if you'll advance us a couple of slides. 2 things that we'll notice this morning. We'll focus our attention on the text. We'll try to see what Jesus does for us as far as the words of the text are concerned. What are practical insights that we can gain from the words that Jesus mentioned? And then we'll notice some takeaways, some practical things. Here are 2 things that stand out to me from the text. We read Matthew 5:38 through 48, essentially. And as we look at the text and we start to peel back the layers of what Jesus was saying, there are 2 things that stand out to me. The first thing is the high standard that Jesus puts forth to his disciples as far as it is concerned treating his enemies or treating their enemies. And undoubtedly, when they were to carry out what Jesus had just mentioned earlier in the chapter, the being peacemakers and being pure in heart and being meek and not reviling when someone persecutes them and says all manner of evil things against them, that's Matthew 5, 1 through 12, the Beatitudes. If they were to live that out in their lives, undoubtedly they would create enemies. There would be people that would oppose them because of the behavior that they've chosen to embrace, the lifestyle that they've now chosen to live because they follow Jesus and not the world. Undoubtedly, they'll create enemies. And so now Jesus is telling them, this is what I expect of you. This is the standard when it comes to loving your enemies. And that high standard in the text in Matthew 5, 38 through 48 is simply this: the high standard of loving your enemies. Now, that's hard, right? And we even think to ourselves, there's no possible way we can do that. And we read it all of the time. This isn't the only place where Jesus mentions it, and other New Testament writers echo the same sentiment. You love your enemies. You treat people that don't treat you right. You treat them like Jesus would treat them. You treat them kindly and with respect, even if they don't reciprocate those same feelings and emotions to you. You do what you know is right, regardless of how the other person treats you. That's hard for us to do. And in our mind, we don't have a category for that. We don't have a category for giving people what they don't deserve. That's not easy for us to do. But when Jesus was teaching in Matthew 5, 38 through 44, it's contrary to everything they had ever learned. In fact, he even mentions that right there in verse number 38. You have heard that it was said. That's what the law used to say. The law of Moses that they were reared under, that they had known all of their lives, it was okay for them to repay eye for eye or tooth for tooth. That it was okay to get even and it was okay to get back. That's what they knew and had embraced under the law of Moses. Jesus acknowledges that in verse 38 and in verse 43 rather. You have heard it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemies. And in both cases, in verse 39 and in verse 44, Jesus' response is, but I am saying to you, you have heard that it was said. It would be okay for you if you were playing to win to go eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. If you were playing to win, it would be okay for you to love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But the standard that you live by as a Christian is different now because you've embraced the lifestyle of Jesus Christ. You don't repay an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You turn the other cheek. You do love your neighbors, but you also love your enemies. That's the high standard that Jesus presents in the text. And that's a contrast. That's difficult because we don't have a category for that in our minds. You look at Jesus and you think about how Jesus exemplified that. I mentioned over on the left, Luke 23 and verse 34, where Jesus in his dying breath, one of the few statements that Jesus uttered when he was on the cross, in Luke 23 and verse 34, it's, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. The last breath that Jesus is uttering as the life on earth draws to an end, at least for the first time, Jesus is uttering this sort of love. I love them. Even though they have hurt me, they are my enemies. Even though they've done evil things to me, I still want their forgiveness. I want their good. I'm exhibiting this kindness toward them, even in the face of the fact that they didn't necessarily reciprocate that to me. Jesus exemplified that in his dying breath. And that manner of living that Jesus not only exemplified, but he also spoke, that manner of living is essential to show our resemblance to the Father. Did you know that? Look at that verse 45. You say, it's impossible for me to do that, but that's the standard. Jesus expects it. And for you to do that shows how closely you look like the Father. And for you to not do that shows how much you don't look like the Father. Notice that in verse 45. I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Why? So that you may be children of your Father. Do you want to know how you're measuring up to the standard? Well, how close do you look like Jesus, or how much do you look like the Father? If you're doing what God expects you to do, then you look just like him. If you're not doing if you're not doing what you're supposed to do, if you're not living up to the standard, you don't look like him. It's pretty simple. that. Jesus makes this point clear to the disciples. Listen, there's a standard, there's an expectation. There are principles that you are to employ that affect your behavior and affect your attitudes, and they make you distinctly different from everyone else around you. You don't look like the world anymore, you look like your Father. That's the standard, that's what's expected. Don't deviate from the plan. People say it's hard. It is. I know it is. The degree of love that we have to muster up in our heart to love our enemies and live up to that standard, it's really hard. And we know love has degrees. We say it all the time, right? I love my wife and I also love Dr. Pepper, but I don't love them the same, right? There's a degree of love that I have for my wife that is more than the degree of love I have for Dr. Pepper. There's degrees of love in life, but the degree of love that demands us to love our enemies is the degree of love that redeemed us from our sins. And Jesus expects us to reciprocate that same sort of love to our enemies. That's the standard. That's the standard. That's what Jesus is teaching in the text. The second thing is this. He says, even the tax collectors do it. You know, even the tax collectors love people that love them. Even tax collectors, they lower the standard a little bit. The standard is you love even your enemies. But see, the tax collectors, they've lowered the standard. And the standard that they live by is they love their own people. And anybody can do that, because if the tax collectors, literally anybody can do it. I mean, they are the scum of the earth people. And most historians will even suggest that this job was reserved for the scum of the earth, because any decent human being wouldn't even choose to be a tax collector, because they know how terrible of a job it is, that they prey on the people that are paying dues to the Roman government, that they would go and they would steal from them. They would manipulate them and swindle them into extra money. It takes a terrible person to do this job, and everyone knew that better classes of people refused the occupation of a tax collector because of how you had to be to do it. No self-respect, no character, no concern or compassion for other people. You're just actually a terrible person. And notice what Jesus says in verse 46 about those people. He says, even those people, the lowest class of people, the scum of the earth, the no self-respect, the no care or compassion for other people, nothing good about them at all. Jesus, in effect, in verse 46 says, even they love the people that love them. They've lowered Jesus' standards, but nonetheless, they still love people that love them. There has to be something about that catches your attention. I think, like me, I mentioned earlier, my tendency sometimes, the temptation is to lower the standard, and that's what they did. And in Luke 6:32, which is Luke's parallel to Jesus' words in Matthew 5, Luke says there's no praise in that kind of love. There is nothing honorable about lowering the standard. There's nothing honorable about lowering the standard. If you lower the standard, if Jesus says this is the standard, you love your enemies, but you say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to lower the standard, and I'm only going to love the people that love me. And the enemies, I can do whatever. That's what they were doing, and that's what we do. We do it with a lot, not just this one. We'll talk about that in a second. But we lower the standard. And in Luke 6:32 and 33, Jesus plainly says, lowering the standard, that's not honorable. There is no praise in that kind of love, Jesus says. That catches my eye. That makes me think twice about the way that I live. Christians should have a love, Matthew 5:43 through 48, that distinguishes them from the rest. That even wicked, evil people salute their own people. And that salutation thing's a big deal with the Jews, right? I mean, the Jews didn't salute everyone. They didn't salute the Samaritans. They sure didn't do that. They didn't like the Romans. I mean, there was all kinds of divides between the Jews. Jesus makes a point to the Jews, like even the worst people, they salute their own. Don't be like them. Don't lower the standard. Live to the high standard of loving your enemy. Christianity was designed to lift men above the level of the average, and that's what Jesus was trying to do. I remember hearing some advice from an older man in our community from time to time, and I know it wasn't original with him, but he passed it on to us as young men. He says, speak to everyone, even those who are rude to you, with kindness and compassion. Show courtesy to everyone, not because they are a gentleman, but because you are. That's what he said. Don't let what you say to them be dictated by the person that they are. You let the standard rule in your life, and you live it regardless of how they act or what they think. You live up to the standard. Matthew 5. 38 through 44. Let's go ahead and move forward then to the takeaways. And we think about what might be real and relevant in our life based on the text. Because I would like to just, broaden our scope away from Matthew 5, 38 through 44 and think more practically about this idea of living up to the standard. I chose this text because I think you clearly see how the temptation is from time to time to lower that. Jesus gives a high standard, and these people were having no problem lowering the standard to fit their needs and what was convenient and easy for them. And we do the same sometimes. But I would like to broaden the scope then to some practical takeaways on areas where we could pay close attention to doing more than the world, to living up to the standard. Now here's these three. Number one, I would like to focus our attention around the fact that Christians are expected to live better and do more than the world. Did you know that? That we are expected to live better and do more than the world. That means that when Jesus sets the standard, just like he did in Matthew 5 for his disciples on the Mount when they were listening to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, that's in effect what he told them. You live better. You live different than them. There should be no comparison between you and them. When they look at people that follow me, they see someone that's different from the world, and they see someone that's doing better than what the world is actually doing. There is no comparison to those who follow me and those who follow the world. You as a Christian, me as a Christian, are expected, if living to the standard, to do more and to live better. Now, I think about Alabama football. I told myself I wasn't even going to mention Alabama football. I wasn't even going to mention Nick Saban said it. But all of y'all that are Alabama fans will tell you that Alabama's just expected to be better than everyone else, right? That's what we all think. Even an LSU fan thinks every time next week, November 9th, Saturday, when Alabama goes to Death Valley, I just expect Alabama to win. It is what it is, okay? Alabama is held to a higher standard because of their track record. And so you take that model and you lay it over Christianity, and you see that just at the very outset of things, when you look at one text in the scripture, it's plain to see that Jesus' followers are just expected to be better. That when people come into Chisholm Hills, they expect to see a difference than the world. When they meet you on the street or at the workplace or in school, and they hear that you're a Christian and that you're a follower of Jesus, in their mind, before you ever open your mouth, they expect you to be better. Let's not let them down. Let's not take away or detract from Jesus because we have a problem living up to the standard, because we like to lower the standard because it's easier for us, or because we're playing for our gain and for us to win, not worried about what standard Jesus set forth. Christians are expected to live better and do more than the world. Let me give you an example of this. In Romans 6, verses 3 and 4, Chris Miller did an incredible job last week on this text. Romans 6. I learned so much from it and was so glad to listen to him preach that. But there was something that just kept rotating around in my mind as he was talking about this text. And one of the things that he emphasized, and he made sure to let us know that that wasn't intended to be a proof text for baptism, but it was to remind those Christians in Rome of the commitment that they had made to Jesus when they died to sin and were buried and rose again to new life. And the whole point that Paul was making and what Chris was emphasizing is that you're different now. You used to live in sin, but you don't anymore because you've died to sin and now you've been made new. The same idea here. Christians, you've got to realize you're different. You're expected. You are held to a higher standard. Your life should look different now because you're a Christian than it did when you were the old man. Later on in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse number 8, Paul talks about how Christians were in the darkness, but now since they've obeyed the gospel, they've been moved into the light. Paul says the same thing in Colossians 1 and verse 13. You've become out of the darkness into his marvelous light. Ephesians 2 and verse number 1 starts this great text, verses 1, 2, and 3, of being alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, being dead in your sins, being dead in your trespasses. And then you get to verse 4 and Paul says, but God made us alive. He changed us. Everything's different because of who I am in Jesus. You read the New Testament, and there's just an overwhelming majority of passages that should drill in our minds the reality of the standard that's calling us to live better and do more than the world. We should just live better and do more than the world. That's the expectation. Jesus says in Matthew 5 and verse 20, we didn't read back that far, but Jesus told those same disciples, if your righteousness does not exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees, that is, if your righteousness as a follower of Jesus doesn't look better than people who have lowered the standard, you're not worthy of the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5 and verse number 20. It's a pity that I have to remind myself of that sometimes, but I fail at it often. There are standards galore. I can make up my own standards. I can lower the standards of God, but what sets apart your ability to submit the standard, rather what sets you apart is your ability to submit to these standards, not your standards. What sets you apart is your ability to submit yourself to the standard and not lower the standard, but to submit yourself to the standard, the gospel, as hard as it may be, to live better and do more. Here's idea number 2. Avoid the average. You know, Christians are in constant danger of being dragged down by the average. Everyone else does it. Everyone else lives it. Everyone else drinks it. Everyone else does it. Everyone else goes there. Everyone else wears it. Everyone else says it, right? That we're in constant danger of being dragged down by the average. And so we realize then that here's the standard, the high standard that Jesus expects, but everybody else is camping out somewhere over here. And it's so much easier to live over here because it's convenient and it's less confrontational. And so I'm willing to abandon the standard to live with the average because everyone else is doing it. I've told you about the report card, or not even the report card, the progress report that I got in trouble for having a C on. I know I've told you that before. And I told my dad, it's fine, Dad, because C is average. You're not average, is what my dad told me. You think about what God's saying to his people. Here's the standard, here's the expectation, and you're fine with living with the average, but you as a Christian, you're not average. You're not like everybody else. You're different from What do we mean when we say we're in constant danger of being dragged down by the average? I was flipping through the New Testament, and I was trying to think of some passages where we can see God's expectations defy the average, go above what everyone else was doing. And there's plenty in the Old and New, but consider just a few. Like, for instance, a big topic right now, the election upcoming. One of the overwhelming points of conversation is, say, abortion, whether you're pro-life or not, okay? And so here you have the subject of life. And most individuals, generally speaking, you could say the average says don't kill. Most people would agree that life is precious, generally speaking, and that it is wrong to kill. That's what the average says. Don't murder, all right? But Jesus, or God rather, in the New Testament, he goes beyond the average of saying don't murder. And in 1 John 2 and verse 15, Jesus mentions the fact that you shouldn't even hate, which is the seed of murder. And so here you have the average, don't murder. Jesus goes beyond the average and says don't hate, which is the seed of murder. Jesus defies the average by setting a higher standard for the people that follow after him. I said 1 John 2:15, and I meant 1 John 3. Here's the second one. You think about how Christianity defies the average. Right there in our text, the average says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Jesus told his disciples, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. How many people do you know that still live by that method today? Maybe you've done it too. An eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. They did something to me, I've got to do something back. They said something to me, I got to say something back. They cut me off in traffic, I got to cut them back off in traffic. I'm guilty of that myself. I don't do well with traffic. I don't do well. It makes me mad when people get in front of me and act like, they never drove before. It's hard, right? And it spans all of the ways that we interact with other people. It's hard not to get back to other people. That's what the average says. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But Jesus says in Matthew 5, verse 39, resist evil. Resist evil. He says, turn the other cheek. He says, go the extra mile, right? Jesus defies the average by setting the standard just a little bit higher. The world says, or the average says, hey, just, drink whatever you want as long as it isn't too much. Just, smoke whatever you want. Do whatever you want to do. Do whatever makes you happy, whatever feels good. You just do whatever makes you happy and most comfortable in the world. Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 5:17, he was relaying what God told him to say. Abstain from every appearance of evil. That pretty much covers it, doesn't it? Here's the average. The world says, drink it, smoke it, do it. Whatever you want to do, you do it. The average is defied by God's standards by saying, stay away from it all. Avoid every bit of it. Don't involve yourself in it. The world, the average says, hey, just go to whatever church you want to. You know, one church is as good as another. You just find what makes your family comfortable. You just go to whatever church you want to. Worship whatever makes you happy and however makes you happy. Jesus in Matthew 15 and verse 9 and in verse 13 says, whatever plant that wasn't planted by my heavenly Father will be rooted up. Psalm 127 and verse 1, David says that those who build a house, they build it in vain if the Lord didn't build it. If the Lord doesn't build the house, then they do labor in vain. There's this expectation of finding God's standard, and it goes beyond what the world says, what the average says. And those are just a few that came to my mind as I was thinking. Some popular standards as compared or contrasted with Scripture, and are sufficient in proving that being a Christian demands that we defy the average and that we commit ourselves to living to the standard. Here's takeaway number 3. Imitate Jesus. That's a safe way to go. You want to live to the standard and not be in danger of being dragged down by the average? Imitate Jesus. You want to live better and do more, live up to the standard, then imitate Jesus. Jesus should always be the example. 1 Peter 2 and verse 21, Peter mentions that Jesus came and he suffered in order that we would follow in his steps, right? Follow in his footsteps. I will follow Jesus, we sing. Follow me. Jesus beckons us to follow in his steps so that we're not led or misled, so that we're not deterred or distracted, that we can follow Jesus in the way that he wants us to go, which is right to the Father. John 14 and verse 6. Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. You know, sometimes I think the reason that we need to emphasize imitating Jesus, I know that deep down we know that's what do, but maybe the problem with standards is that we try to measure ourselves or gauge ourselves about how well we're living up to the standard by looking at all the wrong measurements, right? You know, it's like I'm trying my best to live up to the standard, and what I should do is measure my life by what Jesus did and what Jesus says, but usually I gauge how well I'm living up to the standard by looking at other people. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 12, that's a foolish measurement. Don't measure yourselves by other people. Don't gauge how well you're living up to the standard by how bad Brandon's doing. I'm not going to make myself feel better about being a Christian if I look at how bad Brandon does a great job, but he's right here, so I'm picking on him. But that's what we do sometimes. We look at other people and maybe how good or bad they're doing it, and we tell ourselves, well, I must be doing a bad job if Nathaniel's doing a great job, and I must be doing a good job if Brandon's doing a bad job. But it doesn't work like that. The standard is Jesus. And if I want to live to the standard, then I'm going to imitate Jesus. He's the standard. He's the benchmark. He's the point of reference on which I fix everything that I do. And if that is the case, then I'm not worried about what the average is doing, because I'm worried about what Jesus is. And if I'm worried about what Jesus is doing, then I'm going to be living better, and I'm going to be doing more than the world. And all of these high standards that Jesus set forth that seem impossible in my mind, I realize that I am enabled and empowered to do it because Jesus said I could. I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. That doesn't mean that I can go out and suit up and beat Alabama on Saturday if I pray that prayer before. That's not how that works. But what it means is I can do everything Jesus wants me to do because he enables me to do it. Everything that God expects me to do, I can do it because Jesus enables me to do it. If you want to, you can. You can. You can be a Christian that lives better, does more, not brought down by the average, and imitates Jesus. You can, in fact, submit to the standard. Here's where I want to leave you. I want to leave you with the thoughts that Michael Brody-Waite mentioned that helped him from addiction to success. Maybe in this case, our addiction is sin. Maybe our addiction is something that keeps us from living to the standard. Maybe we're addicted to lowering the standard to make ourselves feel better. Or maybe we're addicted to playing to win so that we feel so good about ourselves. How can we get from addiction to those things to success, living up to the standard? The 3 things that helped Michael Brody-Waite: rigorous, authentic activity. Get busy doing something. Get busy doing something for Jesus. Get involved at Chisholm Hills. As Tony mentioned, I think you said there, how many 4 million sign-up sheets on the window out there last week is what he said. Get busy. Find a place to get plugged in. Those don't fit your eye, come see us. We'll find you a place. I promise there's something for you to do. And even if it's not in the walls of this place, there's something you can do for Jesus. Be honest. Set realistic expectations and realistic goals. Don't set the bar too high that you can't accomplish it, but set realistic goals and get busy doing something for Jesus. And then surrender the outcome. Don't try to control or manipulate how it goes. Put it in the hands of God and let it stay there. And you do your best to meet him right where you left him. And then you're going to have to realize that in order to do that successfully, you're going to have to do some uncomfortable work. Loving your enemy, it's hard. Living up to the standard of Jesus, it's hard. Not doing what the average does, it's hard. Imitating Jesus, it's hard. It's not easy to do it, but if you set your mind to it, and you leave it in the hands of God, you surrender the outcome, and you're authentic and honest and real about your situation, completely honest with God. If God wants you to do it, you can. If He's asked you to do it, you will do it. Living up to the standard. Got to get back to playing to a standard. I thought about that so much after I heard Coach Saban say that, and I thought about how that might help me in my faith, that sometimes I find myself playing to win the approval of other people, win the affection of other people, win the most stuff that I can amass in my life to make me feel comfortable and make me feel good. And I realized how that doesn't align with the standard. That when I do live by the standard, sometimes I might win. That's great. Sometimes I might lose, and that's okay. But at the end of the day, I can lay my head down knowing I pleased my master. I lived by the standard. I did exactly what my master asked me to do. What a mindset to have. Do more, live better, defy the average, but more importantly, for the church at Chisholm Hills and each one of us individually, imitate Jesus. If we can help you in any way this morning, we invite you to come to Him while we stand and while we sing.